What's up, Internet? It is that time once again, the time of year where I have to point out that we live in the worst possible timeline. The timeline where we are exposed to the worst in humanity, the worst possible games ever produced. Games designed entirely for greed and malice and suffering. Games I had to suffer through so you didn't have to because, oh man, these are bad. It is time for the top 10 poop games of 2022. The worst of the worst that I had to play this year so that you can avoid these like the plague and live in a better world. Because I can't unsee what I've seen. Before we begin, I have two Golden Lagoon Award winners for awkward jank or just bad game that I enjoyed way too much this year. The first one going to Steel Rising. Well, I think the name of this game is kind of awkward and jank, and they really should have just called it Bastille, because let's be honest, that's a way better name. This is a neat little game, a Souls-style game made by our masters of jank, Spiders, which should really work on their levels of jank given how many games they've actually put out at this point. I'm really hoping Greedfall 2 is good. The idea of a Souls-style game set during the French Revolution where you play a clockwork automaton is quite cool. Also, you can dress her up like Cyber 6, and that wins some points in my book anyway. But the weapons are a lot of fun, the bosses are pretty cool. It's a very easy to get into Souls-style game. It's probably the second easiest one I've ever played next to Code Vein, and I think this game is infinitely better. But I will say that the story is a total wash, focusing on a bunch of like bureaucrats and higher-ups that have basically nothing of importance to do with anything in the story, but they were around King Louis, so let's kind of make them the focus of the story instead of, you know, the actual plot that was going on. The story direction they took with this one was kind of weird, and pretty much whenever story happened, my eyes were glazing over because it was just not worth paying attention to. But the combat was good and it was easy to get into, and if you've never played a Souls-style game before, this one might be worth getting into. The other Golden Lagoon Award winner of 2022 is Elex 2. Similar to the original Elex, I like this game way more than I probably should have, and I've spent way more time in it than I probably should have as well. But I did enjoy my time with it. I think that the story is not particularly well told, and it's bizarrely clunky at times, trying to force you to join one specific group out of like 4, even though I got to a point where I was supposed to like help one while sort of helping another, but it kind of locked me out of them as well. It was weirdly clumsy and it didn't make sense that that happened. But it's a lot tighter than the original Elex. I didn't fall through the floors every time I teleported anywhere, which is nice, but it also lacked like an instant kill wormhole weapon that I had in the first game, so that kind of sucks. But you know, if you find it on budget, it's kind of a fun open world game, and if you like the original Elex, it's an okay successor, although I don't think the story is anywhere near as strong. But before we begin, of course, we have some honorable mentions. Starting with Megaton Musashi. This was a game I had imported from Japan and had to wait like an extra 6 months for it to get delivered for reasons I don't understand. It, as far as I can tell, was like some kind of tie-in with an anime, or there is an anime tie-in with it. But the game itself was actually pretty fun when it wanted to be a game. When it wanted to be a game, it reminded me a lot of Gundam Breaker. You had a customizable robot that you took out and beat enemies up in a 3D beat-em-up sort of environment, utilizing different weapons, crazy special anime abilities, and guns and explosions. It was an absolute grand old time. Problem is, it didn't want to be a game too much. Like, there was so much just waiting and watching cutscenes and talking to people. It honestly wanted to be more of a visual novel than an actual, like, game. And because of that, when you actually got to the bits of the game that was actually a game, you know, it felt almost sad because you knew that as fun as this was, you were then gonna have to sit through like 20 minutes of people talking and running from point A to point B just to unlock the next mission. And it was really unfortunate because the combat was genuinely quite good. It's just there was so very little of it in a just mire of time-wasty text and stuff. And I mean, if you can understand Japanese, maybe you'll get more out of it than me, but I was there for the gameplay and combat, and there was a depressingly small amount of it in this game that could have otherwise been great. My other honorable mention goes to Horizon Forbidden West, a game that is otherwise basically completely average. It's just another open world game, and that's coming from someone who put the predecessor on his Game of the Year list the year it came out. I loved Horizon Zero Dawn, but this game really bothered me for a lot of reasons. First of all, they expected you to remember every single minor character from the first game. I did not. I didn't care what my character's motivation and connection to them were because my character just brushed them off every 10 minutes. And when you get past that, you just had a giant open world that had lots and lots and lots of content gated to actual story progression. You had to find all this stuff in the story to unlock just random collectathon bits that were mostly pointless. And by the end you didn't want to because, I mean, are you gonna remember like a unlockable that you couldn't get at the start of the game for something you got near the end? I certainly didn't. I didn't finish this game. I gave up because it just felt like so much of a game that didn't respect my time. I did not care about the characters or story. The main character now just kind of comes across as sort of unlikable. They're constantly like pushing away their friends and whatever that they're supposed to be working with, and the character just comes across as kind of unlikable, and the whole plot twist that this game tries to pull out on you really just felt bad and boring. I think Horizon Zero Dawn didn't really need a sequel. I think it worked well enough, but at the best of times, it's playable, it's got decent production value, it looks fine, but maybe I'm just getting worn out on giant open world games, but this one felt like a total waste of my time and money. Moving on, we start off with number 10. Number 10 is Blood Knights, a cheap knockoff sort of Diablo-style action RPG dungeon crawler thing that's sorta kinda powered by loot, except I think the highest level of loot in this game is like +7. It's been a while, but I remember the loot being largely underwhelming and at best, marginal power increases for your characters. The story is largely nonsensical and confusing, constantly contradicting itself, and the characters are largely unlikable. You have 2 playable characters, which would be interesting and certainly is there entirely for co-op, except one of them is objectively just flat out better than the other. They can handle any problem from an entire colonial fiefdom away, as opposed to the other who has to run right up to do damage, and it's really just weirdly balanced and disinteresting. The game itself is at its best kinda sorta playable, and if you grab it at very, very, very deep discount, it might be kind of fun, but for the most part, Blood Knights is at best an absolute train wreck to play. Like, it's not fun necessarily, it's not enjoyable, the story isn't particularly good. There's several like binary choices as to whether you are, you know, a good person or a bad person, but you know, none of the characters seem terribly likable, so it doesn't really matter in the long run. And I don't care about either of these characters, and I don't care about the story as a whole because it's so badly told and so confusing and contradictory to itself. The actual, like, combat is passable, but that's about it. And when it involves, like, platforming, oh, the platforming is not very fun. At the end of the day, Blood Knights is a game you could buy for, like, $1, and it might be fun for an hour or two, but beyond that, or for more money, it's just not worth your time at all. Number 9 on our list is something I grabbed to get footage for our poop game list last year, and I sat down and played a lot more of it this year. That is Skylight Free Range on the PS4, and I mean, I could just stop at this by saying just look at it. It's not a pleasant game to look at in any meaningful way, but I wouldn't exactly be doing my due diligence if I didn't actually talk about why this game is bad outside of its appearance. But seriously, they all blink in unison and they like sway in perfect synchronicity, and it's very off-putting. The story to Skylight Free Range is actually kind of interesting and really deep, which makes it kind of unfortunate that they sold the sequel to this before this one on PSN. Figure that one out. It's a really complex story with a lot of characters that kind of come across as unlikable, but have a lot of nuance to them, and I really appreciate that. That said, while I think honestly the writing is probably the high point of this game, it comes across as very amateurish, for lack of a better term. It reminds me a lot of early Japanese game translations where the translator would just throw swears left, right, and center, and it's kind of like that in this game where everyone just swears way too much and it comes across as really just, this is not how people talk. There's a time and a place for swears, but I feel like it's overused to the point where these become more caricatures rather than like, you know, actual believable people. As an actual RPG, it's interesting, but not necessarily fun to play. Your character has like 40 different skill trees they can spec into, but they have limited numbers of levels, as I found when I capped at level 100. Yes, I bothered to do that just to test some stuff. I'm really gonna have to review this game. I've spent way too much time with it. And they're pretty varied skill sets. You can turn your character into a summoner, but the things you need to summon stuff with are highly flammable, and if you stand in them, you'll die. That was fun to find out in the first 2 minutes of playing this game. Weirdly enough, and I mean, heck, I don't think it was intentional, but if you spec yourself just right, this weird RPG, it kind of becomes like a weird third-person Twitch shooter of sorts, and it weirdly starts to shine at that point. Unfortunately, it very rarely actually gets a chance to shine like that. A lot of the dungeons are copy-pasted, the balance is all over the place, and it's never in your favor or fun. Granted, I played on the hardest difficulty, which basically just doubles enemies' attack and health, but they don't get any smarter or do anything else. They just sort of charge directly at you. AI is absolutely dumb in this game, but there's something weirdly charming about this game too, and I mean, I'll freely admit, I went out of my way and bought the entire PSN back catalog from this developer and checked out their website just to see how weirdly deep and interconnected they all are. The developer clearly has a lot of passion here, but I feel like it's passion that isn't backed up entirely by a lot of talent in all these fields. I don't think that the developer is working with like a huge group of people or anything. I think they're kind of doing everything on their own, and it kind of shows that they don't have strengths in all the fields. And as sort of weirdly, sort of masochistically fun as I was having with this game, I ended up putting it down when I ran into like a weird bug where I ran into a boss that took 0 damage. Now that was intentional, you have to have a specific item to defeat him, but I did have it, and thanks to a weird wonky save in the game, I'm actually stuck in that fight. So yeah. I guess I'm not finishing this one. Maybe I'll just start with the second one. But either way, Skylight Free Range, it's weird, and if you could get it super cheap and you're not completely off-put by how it looks, and to be fair, I know a lot of people really are big into graphics, so this might be a hard one for you. It's a weird kind of thing to look at and see someone's passion put to work. Clearly this is a passion project. I'm not sure it worked at, but it's not a fun game to play. Not like in the least. Moving on to number 8, we're gonna stick to the theme of weird stuff I got super cheap on PSN with Shadow of Lootbox. This game feels like it's designed to satirize everything wrong with modern gaming. And that's great, that's something I can absolutely get behind. Except, it doesn't really satirize so much as it just is a collection of all the bad stuff. Satirization implies that there's deconstruction, and it's unkind to the source material while allowing you to poke fun at it. This is really just a collection of everything wrong, more than actually making fun of everything wrong, and it creates a game that is intentionally designed to take as long and waste as much time as it possibly can. And nothing about it is particularly enjoyable. It's not well polished. There's nothing about this that makes me scream, you know, this goes beyond the point of it trying to be intentionally bad but still being enjoyable, so much as it's just something that's intentionally bad. And if that was the developer's goal, good on you, but that's not really something to aspire to do if you want to make people like what you've done, because you've intentionally made your game unlikable. Well done. I'm not gonna lie, this is a game I barely remember. I played it for one afternoon, and it was just bad. I think the reason why people would buy this game is, as I understand, like, the publisher that the games it publishes are, like, really easy to get platinums in, and, yeah, you can get a platinum in this in, like, an hour. It's a series of fetch quests and pointless missions, and while I do appreciate that the levels try and vary themselves up, they end up feeling all very samey and bland, and there's not really anything particularly humorous or fun about this game. It's also really buggy. When I got to the final boss, I actually popped out of the environment and had to fight him outside the environment because the entire world kind of glitched on me. This game, I played it for an afternoon, I got a platinum trophy. If you want a platinum trophy, I guess that's what this game is for, but if you want a good humorous experience that sort of mocks issues in the actual, like, gaming environment, you know, it feels like a poor man's DLC quest, and that was a game that came out, you know, 15 years ago at this point, and that game was actually kind of sort of good, whereas this one is just, at best, forgettable, and at worst, tedious and broken. Number 7 gets to continue a fantastic trend. We get to throw this on top of the pile of all the other Arcane games I've ever played because I hate them all. And the sad thing is, I feel like I should really like Arcane games. This is number 7, Deathloop. A game that I feel like conceptually could have done a lot more than it did, and honestly betrays its core concept pretty much from the jump. This is a game that kind of tries to imagine what if Groundhog Day but first-person shooter. You play a guy stuck on an island who has to kill a bunch of important bigwigs, and if he manages to do it all in one day, he wins and gets freed from the weird time loop, which, you know, at its core concept sounds interesting. The idea of Groundhog Day, try anything and everything, see cause and effect, and figure out how you impact this world and everything around it. The fact that you have so many targets and you have to do it in 4 different phases of the day in at most 4 different locations, it means that you have to basically take out 2 targets in every location at any period of time. It ends up becoming a thing of figuring out how to influence people's direction and figure out the exact order and location of things. And it sounds, at least on paper, like a great, really deep idea that gives you basically unlimited options and choice. And considering that Arcane really likes to tout that their games are always about having all the freedom in the world, such as like Dishonored 2 and how much Dishonored 1 wanted to think it was about that, although only 1 level was, this game doesn't have any of that, exactly. See, you have to kill all these people at 4 different periods of time in 4 different possible locations. That means that there's theoretically an insane number of possible combinations for how things could work, and perhaps if they had a lot more time developing it, that would be how this game works. However, I will point out that one of your targets only appears at 1 location at 1 period of time during the day. The rest of the time they are gone, which means that you have to kill that target at exactly that period of time, which is morning. So your morning is locked in. I'll also point out that one of your targets only appears at the evening in 1 location, which means that target has to be killed then. And oh yeah, they're hosting a party and inviting most of the other targets. Do I really have to paint you a picture here? Like, they make this game seem like there's infinite possibilities for ways you can approach this problem and solve this sort of kill X number of people at these set periods of time to break the loop, but there's one solution and only one solution to this problem. There's no exploring or checking cause and effect, really, because there's honestly very little options and ways to interact with the world to modify their behavior or figure out like when their schedules will change or what you can do to them. The fact is, there's one solution to this problem and very little freedom to get there. And that's a betrayal of its core concept, and it makes this entire exercise kind of dumb and pointless. What's the point of this game that's all about exploring this time loop and figuring out through the ability of rewinding time, you know, how to change things and make things more favorable for you, how to bring about new opportunities and potential ways to take out your opponents or find new treasure to make your future progression easier. Not a lot of treasure or weapons in this game, by the way. I think there's like 4. There's a couple different skins and stuff for them, but there are very few options for weapons, which is hugely disappointing as well. And the fact is, there's only one exact way to solve this problem, and it's not exactly clever, it's not exactly complex, it's not hard to figure out. And if that wasn't frustrating enough, they have forced invasion-based versus mode to make it even more frustrating. And even if you're playing offline, the AI will just show up and shoot you in the back sometimes. It's not really fun, it's not really all that interesting, and for a game that has such an interesting and powerful core concept, it does absolutely nothing with it and just makes it a very bland first-person shooter. And that's the most frustrating thing about this. This game had a really great idea, and if they had followed through with it, I wouldn't be talking about this right here. This would be on the other list, I'm sure, if they actually followed through with their core concept, but they didn't. Instead, they made a very bland first-person shooter that just for some reason included some Dishonored powers, because why not? Moving on to number 6, we have a game that I think people really, really like, and I don't really get it. We got Pokemon Arceus. Pokemon's attempt at being an open-world action RPG, except it's not an open-world game and it's not an action RPG, like at all, really. You've got big, mostly empty maps to wander around, and while it's fun catching random monsters just willy-nilly without having to, like, do the whole walk into tall grass, make them show up, whatever nonsense, it doesn't really have much else after that. And the fact is that gimmick and the novelty of that wears off very, very, very quickly. After the first hour or 2 of playing this game, I was pretty much done with it, but I kept playing because I know there was so much more of this game. Levels mean absolutely nothing. I caught a very high level monster very early on, and it fought about as well against lower level things as lower level things did, which is strange to say the least. Seriously, levels seem to mean nothing in this game, which is weird. The open world is not so much an open world so much as it is just a bunch of rather large, very barren maps that feel largely like they're just there to waste your time. Although, I guess hunting monsters in it could be kind of fun, but again, I found the novelty of that wore off real quick. There's no real action RPG elements to this, even though this game kind of touted itself as one. You get into a fight, and it's still basically turn-based. The only difference is you can move your avatar around while your Pokemon fight turn-based style. And there's no real reason to do this. Like, yeah, you can physically run away from monsters if you want to actually run away from a fight, I guess, but it's not like you positioning yourself behind your opponent to like catch them off guard will do anything. You can't like have your monster attack them up front while you sneak behind and throw a Pokeball to get like a better catch chance or something. That would have at least been something to justify the way the combat in this game works, but it's just there because I guess they wanted to test out some new things. And I think the most frustrating thing of all is this is supposed to be like the big fancy Pokemon that they were working on instead of the Pokemon Diamond remake, which was also a nightmare. Like, this is not a redemption for that. This was awful and a total waste of time. And the most frustrating thing about this is everything in this game feels directionless and purposeless. Like, say what you will about the old school Pokemon games being way too linear or whatever. If you have a problem with that, fine, I guess. But at least you had a solid idea of what you were doing in it. Here, it's just wander around these empty maps, catching Pokemon like in triplicate until your Pokedex fills out so you get stars, until the game says, okay, you've wasted enough time, move on to the next location and do some story stuff. Everything about this game feels like it's wasting your time, and there's not really anything satisfying or fun about it. And, you know, if you really do want an open world Pokemon game that kinda sorta does it right, but I mean, I've got issues with it too, get Scarlet or Violet. At least that gives you purpose and direction in what you're trying to do. It gives you an actual quest to take part in. It's not a perfect game, but it's significantly better than what this thing is, even if it's got all sorts of performance issues out the wazoo. It was an infinitely better game than Arceus. Fact is, Pokemon Arceus was another instance of Pokemon being a total waste of time. And that's coming from someone who actually genuinely loves Pokemon. You know, I was playing this and still saying, you know, there's so many Pokemon games on this system, why is it that the weird photography thing is still the only one worth playing, you know? Pokemon Arceus, it's interesting, it's experimentative, but it doesn't respect your time, and it ultimately feels unsatisfying to play. And the only thing about it I honestly kind of liked was that they redid Zorua, but Zorua's not that great a monster to begin with, so yeah. Moving on to number 5. We're going with a game I've actually owned for a very long time, but I only really got to play through it entirely this year. We have Blue Waffle! Oh, I'm sorry, Blue Stinger. Same thing, really. This is a game that I remember being not very good, but being charming. I thought that, you know, I remembered it being, you know, not great, but kind of sort of fun. It could be like hidden gem. No, it's not a hidden gem at all. It is pain. If you played this game for maybe 15 minutes, it could be kind of sort of charming as like a sort of goofy prototype Dead Space kind of thing with a quirky sort of tone to it. Everything about this game is awful. The voice acting, while they actually have some really high quality voice actors in here, the voice of Sonic the Hedgehog, Rouge the Bat, and Dr. Robotnik as the main cast, the script gives them nothing to work with, and it makes all the characters just seem like deadpan, personalityless, and unlikable. Enemies will constantly knock you into loading zones so that you can walk back into the room and find that everything's respawned, and if you manage to actually kill them, well, then they'll rip open a roll of pennies they held onto them, fling them in every direction around the room, and force you to go get them. There is an insane number of instant death mazes in this game. They even stack instant death mazes in this game, so if you have to get past one, great, do another before you get to save. It's not very fun at all. There's a weird moment where you have to go collect this thing in order to clear a hazard, except that you can just swim past the hazard if you just position it right. At one point, one of your characters requires you to go get them their sniper rifle, which would be fine if they weren't stuck in this room with a broken ankle since the start of the game and saved your life with a sniper rifle. Yeah, the story in this is incomprehensible, and I'm guessing a lot of people involved ignored notes and editors or something. The story, the characters are bad. There's a terrible puzzle where you have to go and find a shiny object in the middle of a lamp in the background of a room that you have to stand on to find. The shine that the item makes is the exact color of the lamp, only so that you can go to a room, get a thing that holds water, to go to a bathtub to collect water, to walk 5 steps and spray some fire. Except that the bathtub is 5 feet away from that fire and there's a shower hose, or you could just flood the bathtub. Everything about this game is nonsensical and bad, and yet it's not the worst Dreamcast game I've ever played. It's awful, but it's not the worst game I've ever played on the Dreamcast. Moving on to number 4, we have Prism, The Dark Unicorn Chapter 1, a game that is way too many levels of the exact same thing. You play a unicorn who has wings and is capable of flight, but chooses not to because that would have been too hard to program, and instead has to run around with a gnome on her back, who has to flick the right stick to attack because you get no camera control, and that makes combat awful. Combat, like I said, involves wiggling the right stick and hoping while button mashing all the buttons to spam magic, and if you don't take out everything, it'll all respawn way before you get to any objectives and handle them. Can't handle the objectives if there's any enemies about, so you don't have a choice in how you do things, and you can't ignore enemies at all. It's really just beat your head against a wall, respawning at checkpoints, hoping against hope that you actually survive, and everything just happens to die because the hitboxes are so jank and combat is entirely random. There is nothing enjoyable about this game. The voice acting is terrible, the characters are bad and not terribly interesting, the plot is just awful, and it's so many levels of the exact same thing. I think it's like 20, 25 levels, I can't even remember. But it's just, they're all the exact same, and they're all bland and frustrating and boring. This game is not interesting, and I'm still waiting on the sequel to this. I think I'll be waiting a while, but you know, when it comes out, I guess I'll play Prism Chapter 2. Moving on to number 3, we have Saints Row, a game that proves to me that Saints Row 2 was an absolute fluke. Because the fact is, Saints Row 2 was awesome, Saints Row 3 was an interesting art style and a couple high points, but ultimately was just sort of fluff, and everything after it was not worth talking about. Saints Row the remake tries to make it a lot more like the second game, in the sense it's a lot more grounded, but it's also a lot less good. At the best of times, it is straight up boring to play. I found myself just not wanting to play this an hour after getting it, and that's ignoring the fact that it was, at least at launch, I haven't touched it since, a horribly broken, buggy mess. I know several people who beat the game as a toilet because their character models glitched out several times. Whenever you had to do any customization, they erased your customization. So you had to just kind of go without having any custom characters, or just redo it over and over and over and over and over. The people you fight are very, very boring. The weapons, not terribly interesting. The vehicles, the environments are not fun to play in. There was one small quest line involving LARPing that was kind of amusing for a little bit, but overall the entire story and game was just bland open world game, the bland open world game. And I have no desire to play this ever again, or any other Saints Row game. Except I gotta get footage of this crap. Moving on to number 2, we have the single worst Dreamcast game ever. This is Seventh Cross Evolution, a game that is entirely incomprehensible. A game I have dubbed an anti-thing because it's impossible to actually describe it. And yet, I'm gonna have to. Seventh Cross Evolution is a game about evolution. There is a story that I think is told exactly near the end, but I don't think any human on the face of this Erath has ever actually seen it, because you'd have to play the game to get there, and trust me, ain't no one gonna do it. You start out in a little puddle being assaulted by giant enemy crabs, and you're wondering why you have no control. That's because this game is the only Dreamcast game on the face of the planet that doesn't use analog for some reason. And even after you figure out that you have to use digital to move, you're just swimming around a giant donut of water trying not to get murdered by the same crab for about an hour, grinding random pickups that give you random stat boosts and decreases, as well as materials. You then go to a monolith, where you are presented with a sprite design board of sadness, where you're then told to just fill it up with colors and hope. And hope is not a gameplay mechanic. At least it shouldn't be if your game is made remotely well. As I understand, there's supposed to be an AI that's supposed to learn based on your patterns and give you more favorable results from it. I don't believe that in the slightest. I once asked someone who knew a speedrunner who played this game if they could explain this thing. The only response I could get was, they didn't think anyone who made this game could describe it to you. You're just expected to fill out this sprite board and hopefully get a pair of legs or arms to staple onto your creature that hopefully work. Except that you'd need to grind materials to do it every single time to try, And the fact is, there's no coherency or consistency or any real rhyme or reason to figure out how you get what you get and when you get it or how you get it. There's nothing in this game that explains it. There's no guide on the internet, and I have checked, that actually explains this thing properly. The actual manual in this doesn't explain it. You're just supposed to blindly click on this thing and hope you get a result you like. Well, I can tell you, I happened to get the same level 3 pair of legs about 17 out of 20 times. I did not like those results, and yet I barreled on, continuing to get one-shotted by any number of monsters. And it's just unsatisfying, random, and bad, and at the end of the day, it was boring. The idea of an evolution game has merit, you know. The first couple levels of Spore were a lot of fun. Evo Search for Eden, I hear, is quite good. I'd like to play it someday, but it's very expensive. You know, Tokyo Jungle, pretty fun. Games about evolution are conceptually very interesting, and being able to design and create your own creature and have it evolve and grow over time, that's awesome! You know what's not awesome? Having no control over anything, having nothing explained to you, getting killed every 10 seconds because a crab hit you once. Nothing in this game is fun, it is a total waste of time and energy, and it is by far the single worst Dreamcast game of all time. But of course, it's not the worst game I've played this year. No, that honor is reserved for Mobile Suit Gundam Battle Operation Code Fairy, a single-player experience based on an online PvP competitive-only shooter. You know, a game that features no bots and therefore has no AI to really work off of. Yeah, the AI in this game is basically non-existent. They either stand around or rush you, and that's all they do. You play a series of girls that have no impact on the one-year war. It literally starts with them joining Zeon and ends with them surrendering, having accomplished nothing along the way or doing nothing. And I get that they can't affect the one-year war too heavily, but there's been numerous side stories about the one-year war, and they all had very interesting stories. I mean, the Blue Destiny games had an amazing story, you know? There's so many things you could do and invent here to actually make these characters meaningful, but they don't. The characters themselves are weird wooden planks that are devoid completely of personalities, and yet their mobile suits are capable of laughing somehow. And pratfalling and having weird human-like expressions, even though the humans piloting them lack those very expressions. And everything about this game is geared to make you go out, play the free multiplayer game, and, you know, spend money on gachas so you get suits that are actually interesting. Because you're not getting them in this game, which I think is fundamentally flawed in how this game was made, because I don't want to go and play that game. Everything in this game makes me think that everything in that game is going to be slow and plodding. Get knocked down, it takes about 10 seconds to get back up. Yep, it's like that in the multiplayer game too, because I've played it. It's not fun, it's slow, it's plodding. It even manages to recreate the bizarrely long wait times for actual matches like the multiplayer game, because this one takes about 15.5 minutes between 5-minute long missions. I calculated it, and bear in mind, I skipped 2 cutscenes when I did that, so you know what? Recalculation, I'm gonna say it takes 20 minutes between missions. There's only 15 missions, and each mission is about 5 minutes long, but you're gonna sit through about 20 minutes of cutscenes and watching an anime opening and credit sequence and preview to the next level for some reason before you play the next level. But before you do that, you have to go through training that you've been exposed to for 15 levels already. This game runs on a rock, paper, scissors squad-based system, except frequently you don't have your full squad. In fact, at one point, you have 2 members of your squad who occupy the same slot of rock, paper, scissors supremacy. That totally understands the whole point of combat rules, except not. And, oh yeah, they ruined an Ifrit. As a Gundam fan, I have to take personal umbrage with that because the Ifrit is my 4th favorite mobile suit of all time, and my favorite Zeon suit. There's only 8. When you parade an Ifrit out, it is an event. You take this thing to the nines, deck it out, customize it, make it a completely awesome, singular, completely unique suit. Yeah, they changed one of the shoulders, removed the commander antenna so it's not half as cool looking, and painted it lilac. Awesome. And oh yeah, most of those cutscenes that you're sitting around wasting time not actually paying attention to have nothing to do with Gundam. Most of them involve the characters like swimming in a lake, or eating cupcakes, or lighting a Christmas tree. This game doesn't understand the tone of Gundam whatsoever. It is disrespectful to its source material. it is disrespectful to its fans, and it is nothing but a game that exists to waste your time and cynically make you go play the multiplayer game so that you'll spend money on gacha. It's greedy, it is artless, it is lacking in any form of entertainment. I have played almost every commercially available Gundam game. This is probably the worst one of them all, but that's assuming that it is a game. This is a bad marketing tool that is fueled by avarice and is, like I said, completely artless, soulless, and is disrespectful to the fans. And it's just an insult to play this. And the saddest thing of all is, this is kind of indicative of the quality of Gundam games we've gotten since Namco Bandai graciously decided to bring them back to the West. You know, before they did that, we got Gundam Breaker 3, which was not as good as the second one, pretty good game all the same. Now we get, you know, New Gundam Breaker, which was a travesty. Gundam Versus, which is everything wrong with Gundam Versus since, you know, Rango versus Zaf. You know, every Gundam game we have gotten has just been a total train wreck, and this is the biggest, most insulting one of the bunch. I'm not sure I can call this a game because it is just cynical. It is a cynical thing that's supposed to cash in and promote a thing while making money on its own, so that they can get more money from gacha. For a multiplayer game that it takes 15 minutes to get into a match because no one's playing them. This game sickens me. And it offends me as both a lover of video games and a Gundam fan. And this, my dear internet, is the worst game of 2022. I hope you enjoyed, and let me know what your worst games are in the comments, because that's what it's there for. And I hope you'll stick around on this channel by subscribing, checking out my Twitch, and if you really want to make my day, help support the show through its PayPal or Patreon, so that I can continue to afford terrible, terrible games, and warn you all to stay away from them, because these are just not worth your time or money. Anyway, I hope you all enjoyed, and I'll see you in the new year. Peace out, internet.